We have three very distinguished people to represent this, to engage us in this discussion about the economic transformation in China, why, what, and how. What we try to do is get people to really understand China, right? It's not simply commentators, but people who have really been involved in the hustle and bustle of really understanding what's going on in China, who are intimately knowledgeable, but also have an international interest because they are also engaged in the issues of our times with regards to these transformations. So we have three panel speakers, as my colleague Renee said, Dr. Ben, Professor and Dean of International Business School and the Dean of the Academy of the Internet at the Internet Finance at Zhejiang University, one of the top three universities of four in China. Some might argue with me about that, but I think Dr. Ben, you can clarify and introduce yourselves. Then we have Dr. Horst Löchel, who is Professor of Economics and co-chair of the Sino-German Center. He's extremely knowledgeable, coming from Germany, representing the largest economy in Europe, and clearly one that is intimately locked in with China on many levels. And he is also has been a professor, teacher, and a business and involved in the business arena. Last, we have Professor Erik Berglöf, who I hope will join us pretty soon, and who is essentially the chief economist at the AIIB, which is the Asia Investment and Infrastructure Bank in Beijing. He's the former chief economist at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and used to be a professor at the London School of Economics as well. So I'm hoping he will join us very soon. What I'm going to do is invite each of our panelists to take about 4 or 5 minutes, if you don't mind, gentlemen, to outline your thoughts on the question about understanding China's economic transformation. Why is it happening? What is it really about? And how is it being executed, implemented, or even accidentally taking shape? That's what I want. What I would ask our panelists. Take 4 or 5 minutes. When they have finished, then we'll invite Dr. Jin back in, and we'll have. I'll try and moderate. I hope an interesting discussion. So first, can I invite Dr. Ben to share his thoughts, given his deep awareness and interest in China's economy. Dr. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Chandra, and thank you everybody for inviting me. And I'm from Zhejiang University, International Business School. And for those who are not familiar with China, Zhejiang is the hub of private entrepreneurship in the eastern part of China, next to Shanghai, with a population of about 66 million people. And the idea that Chandra, you were saying that Zhejiang University is one of the top 3 universities in China, that can be a little bit, controversial. So I will leave one of the leading universities, certainly, okay? And I want to make sure that my friends in other universities are not too, strong about any opinion I express here. Regarding the China's quality development, I think in China, I would say there are a number of, I would say drivers, okay? And Keyu was talking about, externally, for example, geopolitical tension, the de-risking, decoupling, deglobalization, whatever that has been said outside China, about China. I think that certainly is a consideration why some of the Chinese industries and the companies are moving and reshaping and redesigning a global supply chain. But also, there's a lot of internal motivation for Chinese companies to move up the value chain. Some companies have been relying on the lower, say quality technology and producing some lower value add products to supply to, say, with Walmart in the United States for many years, over the past 3 decades probably. But the Chinese labor cost is going up, environmental standards has been tightened and raised. So that means, the competitiveness of some of the low-end manufacturing in China is less competitive compared to, say, Vietnam, Indonesia, or Mexico. So to that extent, That's also a need for them to move up the value chain. And of course, the other side is that the Chinese companies in general, despite the fact that Chinese domestic market is one of the largest in the world, but still there are 6.6 billion people outside China. That means Chinese companies, they have been learning from the European, American counterparts and Japanese. And as they are becoming more competitive, more leading technology, like EVs, like solar panels, for example, they are eyeing for a global market. So that means they are trying to become a global multinational companies, not just become a local champion in China. So that is the key driver of some of the challenges and the transformation, I would say. Okay. The other thing I have been observing is over the last, say, 40 years roughly, China has been learning, just like universities do. We have been learning from London School of Economics, from Harvard, from Stanford, from Cambridge, any other university. But the Chinese companies as well, they have been learning from the Europeans, Americans, Japanese, even many other countries as well. But the students can graduate. So the China as a student of the West is learning, is climbing the curve. So now they are actually becoming probably a leader in certain areas. That means we are becoming a net exporter of technology, of capital, and many other, say, proven business practices as well, so that they can serve the larger market, especially in the global South, where a lot of say relatively affordable products and services are not easily available. And that's what we call over the last, say, 30 years, we were copying some of the best practices from the West to China. But today, there seems to be another trend, which is like copying from China. That means the Chinese are exporting some of the best practices, technologies, capital, but also, our counterparts in other countries, they are also learning from China. So to that extent, this also gives the motivation why the Chinese economy is going through an economic transformation. And finally, I would say is that some of the traditional industries that China, is going through in terms of transforming to a higher quality growth, is that we are still at the early stage of transformation, like the financial service sector, as Keyu talked about, and many others as well. But I am absolutely optimistic that given the entrepreneurship that is not just in the private sector, but also in the public servants, the mayors, they compete with each other in many ways, okay? To develop a local economy. That gives us a lot of hope that China would contribute in a very positive way to the global growth, because what we have gone through is probably more relevant to our counterparts in some other global South countries, for example, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, all other things as well. So I will just stop right here for the time being. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Ben, thank you. I just got one question before I go on to Dr. Löchel to ask him a question. You talked about this issue about China's, many people are interested in this, China's growing influence, and particularly, from learning to, in fact, exporting know-how and all of that, and the close relationships with the developing countries. You use the word the global South. It's a term I try not to use because I think it has other historical connotations. But you refer to that. Can you just touch on how important that is and your understanding of the impact, both in terms of geopolitics, that it's having on these countries and on these Chinese companies going to these countries? Because in some instances, particularly in Southeast Asia, etc., there are some concerns that these Chinese companies are exporting their technologies, importantly, but can also at the same time be seen as preventing and suffocating growth within those countries and innovations, etc. So how's that positive relation being seen, but what are the downsides for some of the smaller countries in in the developing countries, in the developing parts of the world.
Okay. Thank you, Chandran. Sorry that I used the global south terminology.
That's my prejudice, actually. Don't worry about it.
You know, the global south was not, you know, was not created by anybody from the global south.
Exactly.
It was created.
That's why I don't use it.
So, but in any case, you know, I'm using that terminology in a very positive and constructive way. Yeah. China, you know, is still at the early stage of going global. How many Chinese companies are truly multinational companies? It's an increasing number, but still very few. You know, if you look at the Alibaba, Tencent compared to the US counterparts, if you use, say, Chinese, even EV manufacturers, BYD, compared with, you know, say, Volkswagen, for example, or like Toyota, we are a lot less global. So that means we are only at the beginning of a trend that China is not just a net importer of capital and technology. China is beginning to contribute to the global community with capital, outbound capital, with the technology, with some of the proven business products, instead of just selling products manufactured in China. So as the outbound FDI from China is arriving in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Mexico, or in Africa, those countries will benefit from this outbound FDI, just like China was able to benefit from the inbound FDI from Europe, from America, in that sense. But what I can say is that as Chinese companies going abroad, they are also setting up R&D centers, not just in China. They are setting up research and development centers in other markets. So that means it's not just the high-end activities will be kept as a secret in China. They will be shared with the local market. And for example, let's take an example like Ant Group, for example, which is a fintech global leader. When they go to India, when they go to Indonesia or Vietnam, they set up a joint venture partnership with a local partner. They provide as a service to enable the technology to the local service providers instead of dominating. Okay, so I hope that will be the trend, that it will be a really win-win and a constructive partnership between Chinese multinational companies and the local companies in other countries as well. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. That I think provides a lot of thoughts for the next panel to discuss, because they will be particularly, we have representatives from India, from Africa, etc., to talk about the issues that you talked about. And I thank you for also elaborating on why the Chinese companies are doing this and what that means for the transformation that's taking place in China. So our second speaker I'd like to invite is Dr. Löchel, who is very knowledgeable about China, spent a lot of time there, but also obviously European, comes from Europe, from Germany, industrial power, and who knows, is very well versed with all those interactions between particularly Europe, but Germany and China. And he has his own views about, what he sees is happening in China, or how he sees it from the lens of being someone who spent time both in China and Europe, and the economic interests of Europe and his home country, Germany. So Dr. Löchel, over to you. We look forward to your thoughts about understanding China's economic transformation, why, what, and how. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chandran, for the kind introduction. Also, I'm very happy that you have me here. Also, thanks a lot for Keyu and Shenglin for the very engaging and very instructive speeches. Actually, I want to focus more on the macro level, on the long-term level, because when we discuss the question of transformation of China's economy, I think this is basically a structural issue, not so much a cyclical issue. I have 4 points. The first one is this new discussion on the new growth model The second one is that I think that this growth model has to be supported, let's say, by another growth driver, and that should be consumption. The third one was already mentioned by Keyu about a capital allocation and the financial system, which is very much important, especially for the funding of private innovation. And last but not least, I think also that China should move forward to opening up its economy even more, especially in terms of currency. Let me start with the first point, the new growth model. I think the economic policy of China is very right to move forward to a new growth model. Because this is the only way to get up, let's say, in the GDP per capita and in the income development. This is clearly, we have this experience from the past. China has moved in the last 30 to 40 years to like a kind of industrial revolution, but now it's time to go more for the quality of growth. And that is basically innovation, which increases productivity as well as the value added of the products. This is the right direction. This is also the right direction given we all mentioned this geopolitical tension. We all know the policy of the United States, especially with regards to technology transfers to China and the other way around. So the country is quite right to concentrate on their own strengths in developing their own innovation. I think this is the right approach. My second point is that I think that it's not enough to keep a sufficient high growth rate with further investment, even this is high quality investment. For any given capital stock, and the capital stock in China is not small, and for any given moment in time, there is only a limited number of profitable investment. Yeah, so that means it could be not only investment, even again, if it's high quality investments in innovation that should drive up China's growth rate. It's very much important that also the consumption of the private household speeds up even more in the future. We have still an investment ratio to GDP above 40% and still a consumption ratio below 40%. This is internationally, it doesn't matter, emerging economy, advanced economy, rather low. Normally you have a range of 50 to 60%. And for me as an outsider, let's say, it was always a mystery or a conundrum to understand why since 15 years, the Chinese economic policy was not able to change the situation and bring more consumption as a driving force for more growth. I mean, the former Premier Wen Jiabao already at the 10th National People's Congress in 2007 mentioned this problem and unbalanced and unsustainable. So my point here is China's economic policy should do everything to decrease the saving ratios or the need to savings. And this is basically driven by the improvement of the social security system, but also by reducing inequality. My third point was already mentioned, as I said before, by Keyu, capital allocation matters. There should be a reason why the United States is very much innovative. And one reason is, of course, the capital market-driven system of funding. And of course, private investor has other risk exposures than banks. Banks are naturally conservative because they handle with the money of other people in their deposits. So they are not so open for risky investment in, for example, private small and medium enterprises who are highly innovative. And as we all know, China is still very much bank-based driven. And on top on that, most of this credit, 80%, if I'm right, going to state-owned enterprises, yeah, and not to, let's say, innovative small and medium enterprises. So this has to be changed, probably by more private banks. But even more important is the development of the capital markets. There should take place more funding via capital markets, especially the equity market, and also listing is here a problem. So the authority should have a look to pick up really the promising companies for listing on the stock market. Of course, I know there's a lot of the star market and the Beijing stock market. This is already improvements in the direction for the funding of small and medium enterprises, but there could be done more. Last but not least, China going global. Shenglin pointed this out for the companies. I think it's very much important also to drive forward the internationalization of the renminbi. I mean, as a trade currency, especially with the global south and in Asia, of course, it's already very common to have the trade settled in renminbi. But international currency has two more functions. First, the investment, and secondly, of course, also as a reserve currency. And in these two areas, the internationalization of the renminbi is still rather weak, and the dominance of the US dollar is overwhelming in these two areas. And the conclusion is that China should open up more the capital markets, for foreigners in and out, but also go ahead with the further flexibilization of the exchange rate system to make it more attractive also for international investors to be invested in renminbi. Yeah, so far from my side. Thank you very much.
Dr. Löchel, thank you. Again, really rich comments that I'm hoping we can get into a good, robust debate when we get into the discussion. Just one question for you. You talked about, and I'm not a qualified economist like all of you here, but you talked about early on about the need for China to open up more on the currency side. But the little I know, I can see concerns from policymakers, not just in China, etc., but to let their currencies open up in a way that then they become essentially dominated by the sort of the exceptional power of the US dollar, etc. Could you explain a bit more and even perhaps suggest why do you think that has been slow in China? Is it because of legitimate concerns, geopolitical concerns about opening up its currency to the currency issue?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a question of stability. I think the Chinese leadership is very much concerned of stability, especially in the financial sector. If you remember, we had this big crash in 2015 when the Chinese currency entered the special drawing rights of the IMF. Then they changed the exchange rate, the fixing system. But this leads to a strong, for whatever reason, strong depreciation pressure of the renminbi, and the central bank gets out of the control of the situation. And this is very unfamiliar, let's say, for Chinese authority to accept such a situation. So it's always this tension on the one side to get flexible, and on the other side to have some instability in the financial sector. I'm not saying they should overnight more flexibilized the renminbi, but step by step, because one thing is clear. If China want to play globally on the same level playing fields as the United States, they need also a currency, not only in trade, but also as a reserve and investment currency that could play at least to some degree on the level playing field like the US dollar. And if they open more up, I don't think this will dominate more, this will lead to a dominance of the US dollar in China. Quite the opposite. Yeah, this will lead to more use of Chinese renminbi in the world instead of the US dollar.
Wonderful. I'm sure Dr. Jin, I would like to get her views on it once we open up the panel. I mean, this is going to be a very interesting conversation. So last but not least, and Professor Berglöf, thank you for joining us. I know you are away from China. You're on holiday, so thank you for joining us with the different time zone, etc. We're privileged to have you. What I've suggested, Dr. Berglöf, is to ask each one of the panelists to spend about 4 or 5 minutes to outline their response to that question about understanding China's economic transformation. Why is it happening? What does it look like, and how is it about to change China and the world or the region? So over to you, Dr. Berglöf.
Well, thank you so much, Chandran. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm sorry I was a little bit late in joining. I think we had the time difference wrong here. So I'm sitting on the west coast of Africa. So it's a bit far away.
Which country are you in? Which country are you in?
Yes, exactly. I can actually see my town on the map. And so I have had the pleasure of listening now to Dr. Löchel, and I think I would agree with very much what he was saying. I kind of I'm sure you have done that, but I think it's important to recognize, of course, of what China has achieved. I mean, with its remarkable growth, it brought so many people out of poverty, and it achieved financial development on a scale in terms of households having access to finance that we haven't seen really anywhere in the emerging and developing world, and built a remarkable infrastructure, and it I would argue, maybe others would challenge this, but that China, when COVID hit, was on its way from had shifted towards away from investment-led growth to innovation-led growth. What then happened in COVID brings out, I think, some of the weaknesses that were just mentioned. It's around consumption. So many households have just come out of poverty, were hit by this very giant shock in the beginning of COVID, and many of them fell back into poverty. Their buffers, we spoke about the lack of social welfare net or healthcare on a broader scale. All that became apparent to households that we need to build up the buffers again, and we'll probably need to build even larger buffers for future shocks to come. So that is very much what you see at the moment, and I think that makes this transition into a consumption-based society, very difficult to achieve at the moment. And China, of course, is not alone among emerging developing countries to be hit by COVID and scarred by COVID, but it has been scarred much more than many of us thought, and particularly, of course, the way China initially handled COVID suggested that there wouldn't be so much scarring, but I think we are really seeing very deep scarring. You see that scarring also in the private sector. So, private sector, partly because of the lack of demand, but it was maybe more because of changing in the rules of the game and targeting individual investors without proper consultation and so on. All that has created an sort of unwillingness for the private sector to participate. The financial sector, I think there is now clearly financial sector is bogged down by property loans and so on, but there's also a more fundamental kind of division in China right now between those who really want to focus on the real sector and emphasizing, high-tech sectors, important EV, green sectors, and so on, and those who really want to emphasize, that the financial sector has to be developed more, and that you will not get, I would argue, these investments on the scale that you need without really using the financial system, and particularly what is very important is kind of venture capital, this type of capital that's willing to go into very risky business, and that now in China is quite trouble. And when also the mortgage market, as we know, for reasons related to the consumption, actually people are paying back their mortgages, and the mortgage markets are now decreasing rapidly. So, and then you have the local authorities that are being bogged down by partly not having access to land sales as they did in the past, but also by maybe lending. And that in turn is fading over into the private sector that is being crowded out to some extent, or does not have the same demand from local authorities as they used to do. So that's the kind of short term, and of course that has there are some long-term issues there as well around the ability to further go towards innovation-led growth that probably has been mentioned by others, and then I haven't mentioned just in relationship to the financial sector the issue of the property sector, which clearly is in very deep trouble, and we can say that this reflects to some extent in overexpansion that China did not only for itself but for the rest of the world during the global financial crisis, but it's still recovering from that. And on top of that, then comes demographics. I don't know how much you said about that, but of course China is now for 2 years have a decreasing population and is expected to have a real decrease to maybe by 40% by the end of the century. With that kind of demographics, it's very hard to maintain the kind of growth rates that the Chinese leadership has been targeting, and it doesn't mean that China cannot or that Chinese cannot get richer. There will be plenty of room for individual Chinese to get richer, but for China to catch up with the United States, for example, would be very, very difficult. Maybe if I can mention 2 last points also that I think are important for thinking about the longer term is I do think that China is on a path towards net zero, largely along the lines that the leadership has indicated. That I think they will peak before 2030, and they will. I think there's a lot has to be done, and it's not going to be easy. But I think they have the capacity to reach the 2060 target, and also I think when it comes to nature and the environment and so on, a lot has been done to improve the environment. Really dramatic changes for anyone who lives in Beijing and used to come regularly. It is a remarkable change, and I think there's also a genuine commitment to trying to reverse the environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity. And so these people, Chinese people who will be richer, they will live hopefully in a cleaner environment and with a different type of energy system supporting them. So, of course, what will then happen to the rest of the world is a very different issue. And of course, we know that China itself is very much affected by climate change and the overall degradation of nature. So I think in China needs to stay open, as Dr. Löchel said. China needs to be part of these international efforts to slow down climate change and to reverse the loss of biodiversity. So there are many reasons for China to stay involved, and many reasons for the rest of the world to stay involved with China. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berglöf. So one question for you, then we'll open up and invite Dr. Jin here. So this is a particular of interest to me. Some of you may know I wrote a book called Consumptionomics, and that there is a conundrum that on one hand we urge growth through relentless consumption by externalizing true costs, which is part of it is climate change. And on the other hand, we feel consumption is essential to growth. So given your comments about growth rates, and also should China aspire to grow like the USA? Why? So can I put those things to you and see if you could, in a couple of minutes at least, respond to that, because the questions are also coming up on that point, and just open up that discussion. But can I have your response? I know it's a slightly unfair question, but it's a big question that many of us ask, and I wondered if you would be kind enough to respond, and then we can take it from there. Thank you.
Yes, so obviously this is not just a question for China, as I think also your book indicates. It's a question for the rest of the world, and I think there are many aspects to that. The one is how we measure economic growth, and how we measure GDP. We just published a report end of last year on nature as infrastructure, where we try to look at broader measures using natural capital and so on to capture some of the things that I think are underneath your question. That we need to, we have been expanding economic capital at the expense of natural capital. We need to have a view that brings these things together and allows us to think differently about economic growth and productivity and so on. And I think also it would be, if we take that different view of growth, it will also open up opportunities for many poorer countries today, emerging and developing countries that have very rich resources of natural capital. If we start valuing that in a different way, that it's really something that is not just a local asset, but it's something that's of global significance, that we only start to begin to understand the significance of that natural capital and how much it can help us enrich our lives and can also in medical for medical uses and so on, and all the services that these large nature assets, take the great river basins of the world and so on, how the services that they can deliver to us in terms of transport, flood dam, protection and so on, recreation, all those things. If you start valuing them properly, I think that question becomes very different, because then if we can grow economic capital and natural capital together, I think then this downside of economic growth or measuring economic growth as we have done will be very different. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Berglöf. So let me now invite Dr. Jin back on, and we have about 35 minutes left to have what I hope will be a robust discussion. So first, I'll invite Dr. Jin for a few minutes to just you've listened to our three esteemed panelists say quite a lot of very important things, and some of them in relation to the points you reached. What are the 2-3 things that you would comment on that would enable us to understand some of the tensions? Everyone mentioned the tensions, and particularly in relation to the audience, understanding how would China deal with some of the questions that were raised by our panelists. What struck you the most that you would like to respond to?
I think that we have converged on very similar themes and topics. I think because they are really of primordial importance, I'd say that, China's model has been great at scale and not a great model for raising personal welfare and personal consumption. But there are a range of issues that we can delve into that. I think that what Erik had raised in terms of also the green economy and the climate change, I mean, this is really one of the most important, but also most controversial and difficult issues to deal with. As we mentioned, with the developmental model that China had, it has huge success in these renewable EV sectors, and that's a good thing for the world. But European companies and European countries would say, oh, this is unfair because Chinese companies have driven us out. Now, whether it's really due to subsidies or it's due to enormous competitiveness of Chinese companies, maybe initially helped by these subsidies, is also very contentious. It's very, very hard to know, how to deal with issues, especially in the area of climate mitigation. On the one hand, if the Chinese people want to subsidize these world technologies so that we can adopt them faster, and really, as we have a massive deficit, especially in developing countries, of both investment and technologies for us to stay on track of the green transition, why are we rejecting, Chinese technologies that are both cheap, competitive, and could be scaled up? On the other hand, I also understand the European companies' concerns, where now many also these Chinese companies have been driving each other down to zero profits or close to zero profits. So that doesn't make a sustainable industry either. I think it is really in this area that these industrial policies, the international competition, but on the whole, what it means for global consumer welfare is something that is really a pressing issue, but very difficult to resolve. And I think we need really robust international architectures to deal with this, but also to deal with increasing technology competition. That's another area where, when we talk about AI and data and, the digital economy, now, obviously, this is very now dominated a lot by geopolitical concerns, not necessarily a great thing for consumer welfare again. So how do we balance these things that raise global consumption? On the other hand, there is a beggar thy neighbor, national to national competitive issue. Also in the area of technology, I think is also a pressing issue. I just say that the other issues that were raised by by Dr. Löchel and Professor Shenglin on demographics, consumption. Obviously, we talked a lot about financial system. Consumption, it is absolutely, I think the government has been also trying a lot, right, to somehow encourage people to spend, even small things like putting together the vacation to make it a longer vacation so that people can spend. But, the economic, especially the recent economic issues have meant that they have a flight to quality. A lot of people still camping and, maybe before they were making really good hotel trips and now they're camping. And you see that substitution. Now, of course, that's a short-term thing. But I think that, what we could have really been helpful would have been household consumption vouchers, for instance, if they're afraid of these checks that worked in the US, but maybe it wouldn't work in China. But that also relies on some of the technological issues as well. Now, even though China, most people have mobile phones, a lot of where these consumption vouchers are meant to get to, in terms of the poorest places in China, they might not actually have access for a wallet to receive these consumption vouchers. And so there's implicit inequality issue as well when we think about these consumption stimulus packages, which I think would have been very useful, but they were absent for a variety of reasons. But I really think that it might take a generation, in the end to change consumption habits. If you look at the younger generation, 85% of consumer credit is accounted for by people under 35 and under, and they have no qualms about borrowing university students without an income to spend on a lipstick. If you compare across generations how much they spend on clothing, on entertainment, on traveling, it's enormous in shares. And I think this is just why I think it just takes time, right? It's a new generation. They're born in relative prosperity. They're not afraid of the rainy day as much as, my parents' generation. Even if there were fantastic Social Security, of course, I think it's still very important. I'm not sure they're not gonna hoard, right? And we've seen Social Security protection improving huge amounts since the 1990s, at least, but savings rate keep on going up. But then another more specific issue, for instance, if you look at the migrant workers, there's something like 176 million migrant workers. And even though they are now earning about the same as an average urban worker in analogous terms, they spend only a third as much. So maybe social protection for these people, for the ones that have the highest marginal propensity to consume, is even more important than general statements. So I think these are some of the areas, but I also believe the generational issues are really they just don't think like the older generations. And finally, demographics. I'm probably of the minority camp that do not believe that aging is a first order challenge for China. Part of the reason is, look, as I mentioned, there's still a vast number of undereducated, underemployed rural population. I still believe that the skill education mismatch is more important in the sense that if you look at the jobs that are available in manufacturing, 25 million, or in semiconductors, 300,000 talent gap per year, et cetera, they're not being filled. It's not like there are no jobs around. And if China wants to pursue a manufacturing-based economy, which still is not the knowledge and financialized economy that the US is, they need more vocational workers, they need technical skill workers. And I want to emphasize on the rural area, there's still a huge amount of labor force. But also, I still believe that looking forward, technology, innovation, and demographics, they are endogenous, right? In the sense that we've seen in the data that more aging economies adopt more automation technologies. And the latest studies have shown that these countries are actually richer and because these technologies then get to expand throughout the society. And in an age where we're talking about AI doing remote surgery and thinking, changing the way we live, I don't know if this is, going to be a first order challenge. And if we look at even Japan, if I'm not mistaken, Japan actually Japan's economic downturn actually started when its demographic pressure started to ease. So it's actually not congruent. The worst part of Japanese demographics did not coincide with the economic downturn. And if you look at within China, it's not like housing prices have anything to do with demographics. The older cities do not have lower asset prices. So all in all, I don't want to say that this is not, unimportant. It is. I just don't think it's the most first order issue for China. And I just still believe that there is a massive amount of potential in the Chinese economy. I'm just unsure about whether the right policies are going to be chosen, the reforms are going to continue, keeping your eyes on the economics will be, will still be the case. If that's true, and the market, towards more liberalization, I think that it has a good decade to run. But of course, all these are conjectures.
Thank you. Lots there. I've got two from the questions that are coming in, two questions that I would like both Professor Shenglin and Dr. Löchel to answer. Erik, I'll come back to you in a minute. Just jump in when you want to. But the question is, the first one is around the EV issue, Dr. Löchel. The whole response, particularly in the United States and Europe, has been to the overproduction, which Dr. Jin has already talked about, and therefore putting European businesses under pressure. What do you think about that? Is it essentially the accusation that Chinese government is over-subsidizing it, and therefore this is a problem that the Chinese government should intervene in? Or is it essentially a case of the survival of the fittest? And how do you see that from a European perspective? And Professor Shenglin, from your point of view, how do the Chinese see it? So can I invite Dr. Löchel first to provide a perspective from the European side of things, and then Professor Shenglin to also discuss how the Chinese see it?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. This is indeed a hot debate here in Europe. And as you know, especially Germany, we are also a very huge exporter, and even relative to our GDP, we are a larger exporter than China, because 40% of our GDP is composed of export. In China, it's only half of it. So we're very cautious to increase trade barriers, for example, with tariffs. That's why the German government, backed by the German automotive industry, is very much lobbying in Brussels that we will find a solution then in the beginning of November, that there will be indeed not an increase in tariffs. The problem is a little bit, we are surprised. The German automotive industry was surprised about the scale and the speed. Yeah, we lift the German automotive industry and the European overall, but the German is the strongest one. We live very much from this industry, from the success of the last decades. And if you are somehow too successful, you lost your competitiveness over time. And that's why it's not only about the engine, electronic or traditional. It's also about the technology of the overall car, the digitalization of the car. We are behind of this. The industry knows that. And I think this is not the first time a German industry is in trouble and challenged. Yeah, so I'm very much personally convinced that they will get, let's say, catch up. Now we have the reverse catch up. So the German industry will catch up with the Chinese industry, with the Chinese EV industry as well. But of course, if you are under pressure and if you don't think you can catch up, which is perhaps in other parts of Europe the case, then you immediately go forward with protectionism measures. This is not so much the case for Germany. By the way, another solution which is now discussed here in Germany, and I see this also from the Chinese side, is perhaps we have more investment of Chinese EV companies here in Europe and in Germany. Yeah. So then we have joint ventures here on our own location, which is good for our own growth, which is good for the Chinese companies, and we have not all this trouble about discussion about subsidies and this kind of stuff. So to conclude this, I don't think this is basically a question of subsidies. This is basically a question that Chinese automotive industry, especially in the EV part, are more competitive than the European ones. This is the main reason.
Thank you, Dr. Löchel. So I'm going to ask Professor Shenglin to respond from the Chinese side. But I think what you're saying, which is good news, is at least in Germany, they say, okay, we got to get a bit complacent. The Chinese are producing very good cars and competitive. We will now compete, which is what you're saying, rather than we will put in protectionist measures. Professor Shenglin, over to you. What do you see, given that you're someone who works in China, but you have extensive international relations and you know what's going on around the world?
Maybe, Chandra, maybe I can share with you my personal experience. Exactly 30 years ago, when I returned to China from the United States, we were not able to buy a decent car at all. Old model Santana, which is the basically outdated model Volkswagen, was sold at probably 200% of the original price because of the tariff, because of many other things as well. What did China choose to do? We embraced Volkswagen. We invite General Motors. We invite Volvo to set up joint ventures in China, 50% joint ventures, so that we can learn as well. Okay. 30 years later today, I never expected in my lifetime that China would be able to export cars to the rest of the world. It was not because China was learning fast. It was also a little bit luck because of the paradigm shift. The technology has changed. The consumer experience, the digitalization, as basically, Dr. Horst was talking about. Yeah. That is something that I think the Chinese consumers have contributed, given their very demanding, nature of the, they want the instant gratifications. Because we don't have a lot of money in many ways still as developing country, but we need the quality in terms of the services. That also has driven the Chinese so-called EV manufacturers to cut down the cost, to improve the supply chains, and basically improve the overall competitiveness. So I would probably echo what Dr. Horst was saying, that maybe the Chinese EV manufacturers should go and share their technology and experience with other markets through a joint venture in Europe, in many other countries as well. Thank you.
Great example coming from Southeast Asia. I remember also this kind of scenarios you painted, and all these companies from Europe and the USA were invited. Some of them were not just joint ventures. We gave them pioneer status. We gave them land. We gave them everything. It said, just come and make it here and sell it. We'll all buy it. So thank you. Eric, you've got your hand up. I don't know what you're responding to, but I got a question that I think you will be also suited to answer. But I think it's an important one. Someone has asked the question. The agricultural sector is totally out of the conversation here. It is a high priority of the Chinese government and an essential sector for food security, as well as for thriving countryside and for successful transition towards a new economy that is sustainable. And I know Dr. Jin mentioned it as also an issue when she mentioned security risk. So make the comment you wanted to, but I wondered if you could respond to that. And that question is open to everyone as well. Over to you, Eric.
Yeah, so thank you. And I was going to come in comments on something Keyu said, but maybe I also make a remark on this last discussion, because I want to say, that Japanese manufacturers started producing in Europe and in the United States, and that solved many of these issues that we are facing now. And some of the arguments in this debate, I think, are really ridiculous, about the somehow because you are successful in producing something, you have overcapacity. Of course, you know, I don't know, you know, Norway have overcapacity in salmon, and you know, there are many things that you know, that's why we have trade. But of course, there are some adjustments that we have to take into account, and including the ones that were mentioned for the German industry. So one needs to be conscious of this, and that these adjustments typically affect, you know, different communities, very different groups differently, and so on. All those things we need to be aware of. But some of the arguments you should, I think, get rid of. As Ben was saying, you know, this has been you know, somewhat of a luck, but also, as Keyu was saying, this was extreme competition, and you know, many of these companies are today loss making because there's so much local competition, and there is today, I would say, very little subsidies going in there. There were subsidies in the beginning, and there are still in some cases local subsidies, but on the whole, I think the subsidy issue is not really the relevant point. Now, what I wanted to comment on was what Keyu was talking about demographics. So my point was not that I wasn't worried about aging. I completely agree with her argument, and also I think there's so much that China can do to sort of gainfully employ these older people. The retirement age is way too low, I think, in China for the long term, and so on. So I think that is more. I'm not too concerned about it. What I was speaking about was, of course, you know, when you look at the growth and the size of the Chinese economy, you know, if you grow, if your population decreases, you know, significantly, you know, it's much harder to reach those aggregate numbers. And I think these projections that China would overtake the United States, I think, are a little bit less relevant today. And again, as I said, this is not the important question. The important question is how are the lives of Chinese affected? And here there are so many opportunities for Chinese to use technology in the way that Keyu was describing, and to improve the lives of people, and this may put in pressure on new technologies to be developed and so on. So all that, and we have seen it in very much in Japan. On your question on agriculture, so I think that this is a very understandable argument, and that, you know, China wants to have, and China has the experience of being dependent on food from abroad, and you know, having being hit by shocks and being vulnerable in that sense. So I think China is not alone again in worrying about that. And of course, particularly for countries that are recently become a little bit better off, the prospect of food rationing and so on is very alive and so on. So all those things are understandable. I would say, though, that what China's challenge is more to try to, you know, because agriculture as we see it today, and as it's being done in most of the world, including in China, is not really sustainable, and we need to think about how do we need to change what we eat. We need to change how we produce the food we produce, and we have to do it much more in tune with nature and so on. So I think those are the real issues for agriculture in China over the next say 20, 30 years. So that's, to me, is where and I see also a lot of interest, a lot of attention to this in the Chinese government, both at the national level and at the local level. So I think there will be you know, much more attention to this, and it goes back to my original remark around economic capital, natural capital. We need to think of agriculture much more in line with building natural capital, making these harvests more sustainable, more also healthier, better food, and all those things. So there's a huge agenda there to make agriculture in China serve the sort of long-term economic and social development in China.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's there's more questions coming in, and I think what that question was alluding to is, isn't the food security issue also central to economic transformation, given what you just said, that economic transformation is not just the industrial economy, it's a whole host of other things. And to that, there's a question here about, we are hearing a lot about the need to develop the financial markets. Can the panelists also touch on the need for human capital development in China? What sort of transformations are taking place? And I think Dr. Jin referred to it slightly, but I'll open that to all of you to respond to in a couple of minutes if anyone wants to take that question.
Well, I'm working for a Chinese university. Maybe
yes.
That's a reflection of that we're not doing a good enough job into educating some of the best talents that China's growth needs. Okay, as China becomes more global, more mature, our education system is under pressure to perform better. We are not, doing enough in terms of the interdisciplinary research. We are not doing enough about some of the strategic, so-called industries that we are underinvesting. Despite the fact China has made a lot of progress in the so-called R&D, investment, about nearly 3% of our GDP is invested in the R&D, and the Zhejiang University and many other universities are beneficiaries of this generosity, I would say. But can we do better with the money? Yes, we can. And more importantly, for example, as Chinese companies are trying to become global multinationals, our education systems can be more open. For example, at Zhejiang University, only about 7% of our students are international. Even though at my school, the ZIPS, Zhejiang University International Business School, the ratio of international students is 45.6%. That's the reason that we are growing our international student population, is because we want to make sure we create a multicultural, leadership talent pool, that people who can understand technology, but also understand the social side, the cultural side, the ESG, and people who can connect, the world, basically. So in essence, I would say, for us, okay, the educational institutions, we can work a lot more closely with Dr. Horst, that we are already working together. We hope to be working more closely, and of course, with many other parts of the world as well. So I'll pause here.
Thank you. One question, and then I'll ask for final remarks from each of you. There's a question here about, or any of you could take this on. What should China do or consider, or how should it react to the higher tariffs being imposed by the US and the EU, and in anticipation that things could get more severe? Perhaps I could invite Dr. Löchel first from a European perspective to try and respond to that question, and then anyone else who'd like to jump in.
If I see right, already China is reacting with a kind of, as always, tit-for-tat strategy. That means they all also get under supervision and investigation of some subsidies here in Europe. And of course, we have also subsidies. Just recently, the IMF published a report about subsidies over the world and industrial policy. It seems to be that not only China, but also the US and Europe, there's a lot of subsidies for the industry. So this is the one part. The second part, I hope very much that there will be a negotiation solution within the 3 months. I think for Europe, most important is actually not so much the trade, but even more let's say, the business conditions of European companies in China. I think this is the key point here. Yeah, this is the key point. So if there is some concession by China to improve in whatever areas, let's say, these business conditions, I think there could be a way out of this difficult situation. I mean, we have this report of the European Chamber of Commerce in China, and they list up a lot of different points how to improve. So it should be not so difficult for the Chinese authorities to, let's say, make some concessions on this point. This will be a way out of the situation. Yeah.
Thank you. We got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you all to, in 1 minute each, to summarize the essential sort of question that this session was attempt to pose. So we'd like to get people who are listening to think about, to consider the key issues that you think are pertinent when answering the question, China's economic prospects and global impacts. What do you think? If you could summarize it in 1 minute each. What do you think is China's economic prospects going forward, given all we've discussed, the geopolitics, the nature of China's growth, the history, the need for more time for certain transformations, and what would be the global impacts? Let me invite Erik, if you could start first, if you don't mind, then Professor Shenglin, then Professor Löchel, and finally Dr. Jin. Erik, over to you.
Thank you. So I think China is in a very, it's a very important moment for China. It has to make some very fundamental decisions, both on the short term and the medium term and the long term. So, and we have this important meeting coming up here in China, and I think what I see or hear is not too encouraging that they will address some of these issues. So I do think that the consumption issue, in the sense that we need to make people feel that they don't have to build these buffers. I actually slightly different from Keyu. See, a lot of young unemployed in the cities now. People are much less willing to take those expensive vacations, and yes, there's a lot of pressure with the consumption, but there's still, relatively speaking, a hesitancy. So how it responds now, it also has to do with deflationary pressures in the economy and so on. So I think that is very important for the short term. Then obviously how they deal with the property situation in the medium term, because that's hanging on the financial sector, it's hanging on people's personal economic situation, and it also, I think, affects the long-term viability of the financial system and many of the local authorities. So that's, I think, a set of medium-term issues. Then when it comes to the long-term, responding to demographics is important. I think China is perfectly capable of that. And as I said, on those issues around, China's growth will be smaller than we maybe expected, but I don't see peak China or in the sense of China not being able to grow at significant rates. I think China will be able to grow in per capita terms very significantly, and I see a strong commitment to the net zero transition, strong commitment to addressing the nature capital challenges. So on balance, I think I'm hopeful, but I see a lot of need for doing things right now.
Thank you, Erik, for that very frank assessment. Very useful. Professor Shenglin, 1 minute each, please, because we're running out of time. Thank you.
China is going through a very challenging period of time as we are moving up the so-called higher quality growth, as we embrace the ESG, the social change, the green development. And I'm speaking right now from Xinjiang, China. Xinjiang is on the west side. And after the COVID lockdown, challenge, Xinjiang is, recovering in many ways. I can feel it. And that's probably also a reflection of what I can say generally speaking. Chinese economy will be moving forward one way or another, but provided that we unleash the entrepreneurship, the spirit of innovation that has driven China over the last 40 years forward. And I hope that the public sector, as well as the private sector, can embrace on innovation, on entrepreneurship, and engage with the rest of the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's only in China that we hear people talking about entrepreneurship in the public sector too. And I think 2 speakers have already said to that. So thank you very much for that. Dr. Löchel.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I could not agree more what my predecessors have said before. If I go for a very big picture, I think China did a great job in the last 40 years, moving the country up. We have never seen in history in such fast time from a low income to a middle income country. And now the transformation, the challenge is now to come to a high income country. And this is indeed a challenge, because then it's not only anymore about quantity, but more about quality. Quality in production, quality in life, environmental protection, and all this kind of stuff. So you need a lot of sophisticated capital and even more sophisticated people. This is the main challenge, and there's still a long way to go. Unfortunately, this is very much somehow hampered by this geopolitical tension. So this makes the task for China to move up to a high income country even more difficult. But seeing the progress in the last 40 years, I'm optimistic. I'm really optimistic that China and Chinese economy is a learning system, and I think they will handle this challenge as well.
Fantastic. A learning system economy. Yeah, that we've heard that again many times. So thank you. And the optimism is one I think that many will take away from this conversation. Finally, over to Dr. Jin.
I see China's future lying in the possibly overcoming three important tensions or trade-offs. Just because China didn't like the credit booms and credit sustained investment growth after 2009, doesn't mean that the financial system should not continue to develop and there should be enough finance in the economy to get it going. Just because the big techs have around the world, that is, have not acted always responsibly or are entering new domains without clear regulations, doesn't mean that there should be policies that would suppress entrepreneurialism. These are all important trade-offs. And just because China faces geopolitical tensions, it will still need to resist every temptation to become more isolated and more disengaged. Only by staying completely open and being the most connected component in the world as it has become, is there really a way to keep the sustainable growth path. I don't think it's just an internal economic trajectory. I think in every way, from the capacity issues to the production, to the technology issues, to how the climate change and its interaction with the region, China needs to stay very, very much closely engaged and also help steer the future direction of global cooperation. Thank you.
Wonderful, Dr. Jin. I think on that tone, on that note of China being open, receptive to the world, and engaging and also steering global cooperation is the way forward. It will need partners, and particularly the large powers like the United States, the EU. That's the way forward. And I hope everyone's found this discussion useful. I found it extremely enriching. We've got lots of questions coming in, and to those whose questions we were not able to forward, I beg your forgiveness, but I hope you all enjoyed it. So I will close this session. To all of those who have dialed in, we have another very important session starting in 10 minutes so that people can have a little break. I hope all of you, the panelists, etc., will join in, because in that panel, then we have people from India, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, and the United States joining in to answer the question about the global impact of China's economic transformation and from the ground up. So I encourage everyone to join us. I'll hand over to Renee to do the transition. That'll be a 10-minute break. But please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for taking their time and sharing their thoughts. Thank you very much, panelists, and to the keynote speaker. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Enjoy Marrakesh, Dr. Berglöf.
Thank you.